with Virginia Volker for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. We're at Miles College, June 26, 1996. Thank you, Ms. Volker, for taking time out of your schedule for coming over and sitting with us today to talk about your experiences in growing up in Birmingham and how you have related to the movement. It's a pleasure having you here. Just tell me a bit about yourself. What are you doing now?
Thank you, Dr. Huntley. I really appreciate all the work you're doing in this arena. Currently, I'm a faculty member at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I'm in the biology department, and I teach anatomy, pathophysiology, and a number of the health sciences. In addition to that, I've been involved in a number of community projects, and this summer, as part of my UAB work, I'm also serving as campus coordinator for the UAB, Miles College, Lawson Community College, Titusville 2000 project, which we have a HUD grant that we're operating from.
Mm-hmm. Now, is it Ms. Volker or Dr. Volker?
How about MS?
MS.
Yes. I don't have a doctorate.
Okay.
I have 2 master's degrees.
Okay, well, 2 masters ought to add up to a doctorate then.
Well, I'd be glad to take it if you take the salary with it, but it doesn't work that way.
Where were you born?
I was born in Jasper, Alabama.
Jasper, Alabama. Were your parents originally from Jasper?
My parents were from the Walker County area, yes.
Walker County area. And brothers and sisters, how many do you have?
I have 1 brother, 1 sister.
1 brother, 1 sister.
They're both younger. I'm the oldest child.
Oh, okay. Your mother and father, tell me just a bit about their educational background.
It was rather limited as far as formal education. My mother says she went to school 3 days. I don't know what the truth is. My father had more education, but they were certainly part of the rural, come to the small town type person in the Walker County area. Walker County is a very depressed area of the state, or it was at that time. And my parents come from rather modest means. My father is, they like to say they were land rich, but money poor. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think that probably his family had homesteaded there under some of the Homestead Acts that came about around before the turn of the century. Right. My mother, similar background, although my grandfather on my mother's side was sometimes a miner. And
coal miner?
Coal miner, because coal was one of the main industries in Walker County. And he also was at times a tenant farmer. On my father's side, what I know more about their background is that they were part of the, or at least part of the family, were people who were opposing seceding from the Union.
In Walker County?
In Walker County. We hear about the Free State of Winston and the work that, efforts that were made in Winston County to try to not join the Union around the Civil War times. But Walker County is essentially next door to Winston County. And so there were groups of people in that region that were also, in fact, all across North Alabama. And apparently they were saying, some of the slogans in North Alabama around the time that the Formant was building for the Civil War. They were saying that would be a rich man's war, poor man's fight. And very much were opposed joining in with the Confederacy. Right. And supposedly my father's father, I guess it would be my father's father or my father's grandfather, I guess was what it would be, was involved in, quote, giving aid and comfort to the Union soldiers. I think it was Wilson's Raiders that came through. We found this out through some genealogical study, that they were thought to be sympathizers with the Union.
So your family has been on...
And were in fact reimbursed for giving food and whatever else he gave to some of the Wilson's Raiders as they came through Walker County. So I suspect I came from a long line of people that followed their own principles and own values rather than just succumbing to what was going on around them.
we are very much aware that only 20 to 25% of whites in the South actually owned slaves.
That's right.
So that meant that 80% basically did not. And I'm assuming that that is what you mean when you talk about this war being a rich man's war.
And a poor man's fight, because
yes.
also many, from what I've read of that history, is that it was the more affluent South Alabama people that had slaves.
Right.
You didn't have the big farms, the big plantations in Walker County. They were coal miners and small farmers.
Right.
And so they had no need for slaves, really.
That's right. Yes.
And so it was, there's at least some historians I've read portray what was happening in Alabama around that time, that there was actually a fight going on between North Alabama and South Alabama. I don't know if you've read much of that.
Right. Yes, I have. And that's a continuing struggle.
It certainly is. And in fact, I think nationwide we're sometimes still fighting the Civil War, at least some of us here in the South.
Right. Yes. Well, tell me just a bit about your upbringing. What do you remember about your childhood? You were born and reared in...
I was in Walker County, in Jasper, small town. Lived in the town for a while. My father was a Methodist minister. He was a kind of circuit rider. And he was also a small businessman. He's a barber. I understand before I was born, he'd had a grocery store. My mother didn't work part of the time. Then part of the time she worked as like an LPN, a licensed practical nurse. And then as we got older, she worked as a pie baker. In a local restaurant. But she was pastry cook, I think was the title they used. So I had a rather quiet, actually very conventional childhood in many ways. Went to church a great deal.
Right. Well, with your father being a minister.
I went to the Methodist church when the doors were open and when the doors were closed also. And my parents also were very insistent that we go to other churches in the community. And we also went to churches with our various relatives when we visited with them all over Walker County area. So I know a lot about all the small town churches.
Yes.
And that was part of my socialization and my outreach and being more involved.
Do you remember any relationships with blacks in your childhood?
I do, interestingly enough. I've wondered often why I would be so conscious of race, because, I felt like that probably a number of my peers were not, but it may be because where I lived within Jasper, there was a very clear dividing line. There was a railroad track, and on one side was the white community, and on the other side was the black community. I lived close enough to the black community, on my side of the railroad track that, I could sit in my front yard, and if I really looked and peered closely, I could see some of what was happening across the track, which was sort of, in some ways, forbidden territory. But my father had interactions with people in the black community. He raised goats for supposedly to have goat's milk because he thought that was healthy. And and there were apparently he had some friends in the black community that raised goats. So one of the things that we would do is we would go across the tracks, and sometimes I get to go with him to visit and look at goats, and if my mother and I went along, we obviously interacted with the whole families, and so I became very aware that there were differences. I think subconsciously I picked up that people behave differently around the race issue. So it was, I was very aware of that at an early age.
Did you have blacks working in your home for your mother and your father?
On very rare occasions, very rare occasions.
And what did
we were lower enough income that we didn't have that very often. But sometimes there would be black people come by and help do odd jobs around the house. But
and what was your age? How old were you at that particular time? I know that you lived in Jasper, and then you eventually would move to Sylacauga.
I did not move to Sylacauga until I was in high school.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any black friends? As I grew up in Birmingham, we had white friends because we lived on one street and they lived on other, and we played together. Was that the same case with you in Jasper?
I really don't recall that. I remember being aware of, interacting briefly with black children, more when I would go in the black community with my father.
Right.
One of the things I remember is, I guess it was a very typical black community of the South at that time. And what I as a child found fascinating was that some people had goldfish ponds in their home. This was, if you didn't live in that era, and if you don't know anything about that, you cannot imagine why anybody would just dig out and make a little very home-crafted goldfish pond. But a lot of people did, and I guess it was a kind of art that people in the black community engaged in more than in the white community as far as having goldfish. So I remember going into the black community and observing the goldfish, and there would be black children around I would interact with. And there were probably black children that passed my house that we may have interacted with some, but I don't have a deep recollection of that like you have.
Closeness.
And like I've heard other people talk about.
You were the oldest of three children.
Right.
And so you were sort of the trailblazer for your two siblings.
Certainly was.
How did that impact on your growing up, having two younger siblings? Did you have to help around the house?
I did, but I was 5 years old before my younger brother was born, so I think I really got ingrained in me that sense of being the only child, and I was probably had that mentality of being the only child but also with a brother and a sister. So
what do you remember about your school days, just growing up in Jasper? Just tell me a bit about.
I loved school. I guess that's why I still work in a school. I really enjoyed going to school. Remember my first grade teacher, Miss Hollis. I can't say she taught me to read because my mother had taught me to read before I went to school, but I certainly remember her interacting with her. Come to think of it, maybe it wasn't Miss Hollis, but who knows?
Yes.
That was one of my teachers somewhere along the way that popped out.
Yes.
But I remember it was an all-white school. Race was not a particular issue at all at that time. I don't remember anything about that being discussed in school. It was just, there was one race, there were white folks. I remember being aware of religious differences in that there were several Jewish children in my class with me throughout my school career, elementary school career. And I know that it must have been very difficult for the Jewish children in Jasper because it was a very small community. And their parents really worked hard to help their children be included. I remember that the parents of one of my Jewish friends always brought goodies to school for Christmas. And so we always talked about Christmas, and we did talk about Hanukkah, which I think was probably unusual for an Alabama small-town school in the 1940s. And I think that has to do with the perseverance and the dedication that some Jewish parents had at that time, and probably the openness that some of the school teachers had. So I was aware of that they were different, but yet, something was different about them. They didn't celebrate Christmas, but yes, they did celebrate Christmas. And we certainly interacted and visited some in each other's homes.
Right. You say you moved from Jasper to Sylacauga? Is it your family moved?
I went to Sylacauga. My family moved to Sylacauga when I was in high school, which would have been mid-1954. Okay. The Supreme Court decision year.
Right. Okay.
I remember being aware by that time of what was happening in the world around me.
You remember Brown versus Board? Being aware of...
Being aware of that having taken place.
How did that impact upon your environment?
Not at all at that point, because I remember hearing a lot of discussion about those Supreme Court judges and how everybody hated them. But I think one of the things that probably was a real support and helpful to me in growing up was the ability to go to the library. And the fact that my parents always encouraged me to go to the library, took me to the library. The public libraries of that time, and this would have been in Jasper before I actually moved to Sylacauga, the public libraries did have a lot of the books, the autobiographies of boys and girls who made good. And the books did include stories of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and George Washington Carver, those kinds of classic people, as well as the Lucretia Mott's and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's. And I ended up reading a lot of biography, and for whatever hundreds of reasons, I very quickly identified with that group of people and felt some kinship.
What group of people are you talking about?
But the group of people whose biographies I would be reading as a child, the freedom fighters, the abolitionists, that group of people.
So
I became aware of struggles around justice issues and that the world was not perfect. It probably has something to do with just being white and Southern. I think there's a white Southern mentality of a kind of complex of somewhere between inferiority and defiance that sort of is in the milieu around us that we grew up with in Walker County.
How soon do you think that, I mean, you're saying that these individuals who were revolutionaries, freedom fighters, you were sort of attracted to them. At what point in your life do you think that was taking place?
I think that must have been somewhere between about the 5th grade and 7th and 8th grade.
Was that different?
And that was before, that would have been early 1950s.
Was that different than your peers, or was that, did you stand out as a result of that? Were you one of those people who was looked at by your peers as being different?
I felt different. I felt like I was a child that made good grades, and I minded the teacher, and I was sometimes called the teacher's pet and the preacher's kid. So
goody two shoes.
Goody two shoes. That was me. Carried my Bible, that kind of thing. So yes, I think that I did. It didn't particularly bother me, or I'm not aware of it bothering me at that point.
How did your peers treat you as a result of the way that they perceived you? At
that point, I don't recall any kind of...
Any differences?
Any problem.
Okay. Were you involved in extracurricular activities? I know in high school, when you get to high school...
In high school, I did. In junior high school, that was kind of not very much.
Yeah.
In fact, if they existed, I don't recall them. And also, my family was my family was into, I guess, probably protecting me in some respects. So they probably encouraged me staying at home reading rather than being involved with whatever was happening around me.
Okay.
So hence my link to the world was what I was getting on the news media and newspapers and what I was reading.
Did that change when you got in high school? Were you more
that
active?
Changed in high school. I deliberately made an effort to get more involved, to make friends.
What were you involved in high school that sort of sticks out in your mind?
Let's see, I remember Beta Club.
And
whatever.
Beta Club was what?
An honor society.
Okay. Was that math honors?
It's just in general honors.
Okay.
Yeah. I was active in the church during my high school years then. Methodist Youth Fellowship. MYF, yes, Methodist Youth Fellowship. So that, and I remember during that time, the winds of change were certainly upon us. And issues were discussed in my church. I remember one several interesting discussions around when I was a youth, still in high school. The literature that we were receiving from the Methodist headquarters nationally had pictures of black and white people sitting together in it. And there were big controversies about could we use this literature with our young people. And
it would have an impact upon the way you view the world.
That's right. Maybe they were right. It would. It did. Yes. But just the fact that it became a controversy, and for whatever reason, I immediately thought, well, there's nothing wrong with this. My parents, my mother was very conservative acting, very don't rock the boat person. My father was more of a, it's okay to state your case and stand up. Their side would be, yes, it would be okay to use the literature. I guess it proved that the predominant people in it, or the dominant group in that church, brought to bear that it would prevail, because I remember we did use that kind of literature.
Was this the Methodist Church?
This is United Methodist Church, North Alabama Conference.
Why did you move from Jasper to Sylacauga?
By that time, my father was not being a minister anymore, and it was a better business opportunity for him. Okay. He was a barber.
Oh, he moved there?
He moved there as a barber.
Okay. Were there any incidences in high school, not necessarily racial, that sort of stand out in your mind about your experiences in high school? You know, there are any number of things that I can think of that I was involved in during high school days that probably had an impact upon my going in one direction or another. Do you have any of those?
I think probably what was happening nationally was when I was in high school, Sputnik had come along, or was about that. There was a big effort to build the spaceships. So we were beginning to engage in the race for space. Right. And Sputnik, I think, was probably 58, the year I was a senior, 57. And before that, it had been building. Yes. So there was a lot of concern that science was important in our, very much like we are today, that, gee, our students in the United States are going to get left behind in science if we don't do something. And I think because I made good grades in science, I made good grades in everything. But it's because I made good grades in science, I got attention. Right. So I was like, I was in science fairs. I could win a science fair. I got special attention for being the only girl that would take physics, a group of all guys. The teacher was a guy, but he was really very nice. I think of the my high school biology teacher, Ms. Heaton. I think that had an impact to have a woman as a science person that I interacted with when I was enjoying science, and for her to encourage me. I tend to think that was important, because if she had not been there, I don't know if I may have still found my way in science, but that was a kind of way of saying, hey, it's okay for women to be in the field of science. It's okay for us to cut open frogs and look at microscopes and do those things that girls were really not supposed to do then.
There were a number of racial issues that were taking place because, as you said, Brown versus Board happened in 1954. 1955 had the Montgomery bus boycott. 1956, we had the outlawing of the NAACP in the state, and then the development of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And, of course, in 56, you had a number of bombings with Shuttlesworth. Was that in any way in your...
I think I was aware of it in reading about it, but Sylacauga was 50 miles and worlds away from Birmingham. Sylacauga was very much a predominantly white city. Right. There was a black population, but it was almost invisible to me at that point. I didn't even know where the black schools were. It was that kind of community, and that I was moving in at that time. Right. I do remember being aware of the bus boycotts and feeling a kinship with that struggle. And I remember one of the times riding a bus from Sylacauga to Birmingham, and deliberately going to the back of the bus to sit, to show my identification with that. And it's like, some of the older black people that were sitting in the back said, honey, you go up there and sit. It's like, oh, no, I'll just sit here. I'm fine. It was just, that was my naivete. But again, it was, it was like I was saying, hey, I'm identifying with this, although I wasn't saying that. And I think probably because I was young and a female, you could do those things, whereas I think if I'd been a guy and did that, I might have been a problem. And certainly, if it had been reversed, a young black woman is sitting there in the front of the bus, that would have been a major problem.
Did any of the whites on the bus say anything to you about sitting in the back?
You
don't remember?
I don't remember. I think they just ignored it.
How often did you come to Birmingham?
Every now and then, but not a tremendous amount of time. But I do remember doing that on several occasions.
Were you alone when you?
When I would be alone. Yeah.
Why would you come to Birmingham? What would be the occasions for you to come?
I don't know. I think sometime I came up to look at the schools here. I remember going to Birmingham Southern a weekend. That kind of thing.
All right. And after you finished high school, which it's around 1960?
I finished high school in 58.
In 58. Okay. Things are really
heating up. But let me tell you before we finish with this Chicago experience. I remember that the Klan was very active there. It was Klan territory.
Right.
My family was far removed from it, but I do remember one day there was one Saturday afternoon in the summer, there was a Klan parade downtown. And I remember stumbling up on it. I think my mother was with me and a girlfriend. And I remember my girlfriend and I started throwing rocks and yelling at the Klan parade, calling them cowards or something like that. And my mother just freaking out. It's like, come on, you're going to get us killed. Let's go. And pulling us, practically having to pull us away and getting us home from that incident. And I think I remember her talking about being fearful that they would know who we were and that we would come have a cross burned in our house or our house burned down.
Was they ever?
That never happened. Again, we were white kids. You're white kids and throw rocks. There's some white privilege going on there. Sure. If it had been black kids throwing rocks, that wouldn't have been the same.
Were there any reactions from the Klan?
They just sort of looked at us.
Were they hooded? They
were hooded.
On?
Yeah. Okay. They just sort of, I guess, chalked it up to, children's pranks. They didn't understand the depth of our feelings about that.
Sure, yeah. I can remember. Now that you mentioned, I remember my aunt lived in Columbus, Georgia, so we would always go 280, and in probably Sylacauga or somewhere in that area. On several occasions, the Klan was stopping the cars, asking for donations. But I remember when we got to them, they didn't ask us for anything; they just let us through.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I remember that because I remember coming across the mountain and through the
winding roads, the narrows. Yeah.
So that's interesting that you actually saw the Klan, and you were incensed by what they represented, so you reacted to that. So after you then finished high school in 1958, what did you do? Did you go off to college?
I went to college at the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa.
Okay. And now this is in the sort of the heat of things as well.
The heat of things were going on. And what I basically remember around the civil rights issues from college is toward my junior and senior year, having my own group of friends that believed like I believed, that we thought the civil rights movement was the way to go, and that we were beginning to feel, shall we say, left out in Tuscaloosa. It's like we were reading about college students and other places were making their protests and expressing themselves, and here we were sitting in dull old Tuscaloosa, Alabama, on the university campus. Somehow, by the time I was beginning my senior year, member of my group had a contact with Stillman College, which was the small private black school in college in Tuscaloosa.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up having, somehow arranging for several of us to go from the campus, Tuscaloosa University campus, to Stillman campus. Mm-hmm. And we met and we called it like a brotherhood tea, because by that time we were aware that there were brotherhood Sundays and brotherhood teas. That was what people of goodwill and churches tried to do then. Mm-hmm. If anybody knows what a brotherhood tea is, it's when black and white people can stand in a room and they drink their tea and the world didn't fall apart, mm-hmm. Because they were in the same room doing something mm-hmm. social together. And that sounds silly today, but at that point... Those kind of
meetings were illegal at the time.
They were illegal, and,
yes.
and it was a very, high anxiety type event for people to do. Probably, mm-hmm. certainly for white people, probably for the black people. Mm-hmm. In fact, I remember one of my classmates back at Sylacauga, one of my classmates was the minister's son in Sylacauga, and at somewhere around that time, they had a Brotherhood Sunday tea at the First Methodist Church in Sylacauga, and after that there was a cross burned in front of the church after a Brotherhood Sunday tea.
Mm-hmm. It was instructive that you suggested that when you were in Tuscaloosa, you went from University of Alabama to Stillman. Did you ever have students from Stillman to come to the University of Alabama?
Didn't do that. We were prudent, pragmatic, or cowards, whichever way you want to talk about it. But what we did is we ended up, there were a group of, I suspect overall there may have been about a dozen or 15 of us from the Tuscaloosa University Alabama campus that we knew each other, and we felt strongly that we should be doing our share to promote civil rights. And and so we started meeting with some people at Stillman, and I'm not even sure how that group of students got pulled together, but we interacted enough that we became friends with some people.
And this was always on the Stillman campus?
On Stillman campus.
Yeah, okay.
We talked about coming over to the University of Alabama campus, but always the decision was made was no.
In 1960, demonstrations were going on all over the South with the sit-in struggle. Of course, starting in North Carolina.
Right.
And then coming into South Carolina and Georgia. Mm-hmm. Was that ever an effort in Tuscaloosa?
We did that. I know there was more happening than what I was involved in, but mm-hmm. our small group of college students, Stillman and University students, we decided we wanted to do some sit-ins at churches. And I remember that we planned several, and I remember one I participated in. We went to, I think it was the Westminster Center, probably was like the Student Center for Presbyterian students, mm-hmm. or it may have been the Presbyterian Church. It was somewhere nearby campus. Mm-hmm. And so we carefully planned our agenda, how we were going to have some black students were going to show up, and if they got in, what would happen, and then we were going to come be their support with these students from the Tuscaloosa University mm-hmm. campus. And interestingly enough, at that particular church, Westminster campus, and they seated the black students. And
what year is this? 61?
This must have been 61.
Mm-hmm.
61. Mm-hmm. And so we, as the white students in there, we were coming in, we were going to be visitors, so we didn't know anything else to do but go down and sit beside them. Mm-hmm. And so that was obviously then we were all together. And I remember afterward, some probably elders of the church came out, and there were some of them were obviously university faculty, mm-hmm. and they actually spoke and were pleasant. Mm-hmm. And so it was like no contest, no mm-hmm. problem. Mm-hmm. We were both pleased and somewhat shocked mm-hmm. at that reception. If it had been another kind of reception, heaven knows what we would have done, because we really were not in contact with any national organization at that time. As we continued to meet, though, we did somehow somebody in the group had contact with a SNCC person. Several of us went to a SNCC conference in Atlanta, must have been either 61 or 62. I found that very interesting. I still have some of the literature from that conference.
Is that right?
And I actually know some of those people from that conference now.
Well, that's really in the beginning of SNCC. Now, SNCC is organized in 1960.
So this was, it was a very young organization then.
And this is at the point where young white college students were coming down from the north to get involved with SNCC,
Right.
particularly in Mississippi. Was there a SNCC organization in Tuscaloosa?
No, not to my knowledge.
Okay.
But they were some of the people at SNCC at the Atlanta conference were just very pleased that they had some Alabama students there. Apparently we were rarities.
Yes. What did you do after that?
We continued to have our meeting. We did a few, always on Stillman campus. We had a few socials. We talked about what all should be done. A lot of talk, a lot of building some friendships with each other. A lot of long night phone conversations. It was sort of a real, probably a source of excitement if guys could call the dorm, guys from Stillman could call the dorm, disguise their voice and ask to speak to one of the white girls in the dorm without anybody recognizing that he was black. And I guess vice versa, we called, that did the cross-calling to their dorms. Toward the end of our senior year, it was my senior year for me, I think, and most of us were juniors, seniors, and some graduate students. Someone got wind of what we were doing and called our activities, which were very mild in retrospect, called to the attention of the University in Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama authorities. The women on our side got called in by the Dean of Women, and the men got called in by the Dean of Men.
What was the gender makeup of the two groups?
Probably about half women, half men. Probably a few more women than men. I remember Dean Healy was a dean, and she, proceeded to tell us how she really understood our desires to be involved in what we were doing, but that it was not safe, and university had to watch after our safety, and they were afraid we were going to get hurt by the Klan, and I'm sure that's really how they were feeling, and that they really wanted us to stop doing that, and that the university was going to integrate soon, but they didn't want any problems until the university did integrate, and they asked us to not go.
Did you stop?
They did the threat of, gee, all of you have such good records, it would be a pity since you're so close to graduation, this is the way to lose this. Didn't say they would throw us out, but it was the threat of, and we were really scared. So all of us on our side of campus said, gee, we'll not do it anymore. We understand. And what we did is we just proceeded to be more covert.
Did the telephone calls continue?
We tried to make them less frequent, but we still did it, and we still visited. And I remember, I guess it was about the last week of school, we decided to be more open. We just very boldly went out and didn't do our little circuitous routes to get there, and went out anyhow. Or last year for some of us were seniors.
Did any of those relationships last after school?
Yeah, I've maintained contact with some of the people up until even, in the past decade.
Yeah. So you were finishing undergraduate school in around 62?
62, okay. Right.
It would be 63.
Then I was in Birmingham.
Oh, okay. So you were here during the demonstrations of 63?
63 was a very momentous year.
Where did you live?
I lived on the south side. I lived in sometimes in the dorm, which is now where the Radisson Hotel is. And then sometimes I lived in an apartment building on 17th and 10th South, in an apartment building which is now Ronald McDonald House. It did not look as nice as it does now. But I was in graduate school, in the medical school, and I was studying anatomy, in human anatomy then. Far removed from what was happening in Birmingham at the time, but it was discussion. Everybody was discussing what was happening with the civil rights movement. Only there were other terms for it then in the white community.
What were those terms?
Let's see, what were they? All this nigger business, all this outside agitation, communist plot, those kinds of real derogatory
general
terms.
feeling of people that you were associated with at the time?
That was a feeling of some people. There were some people that were more thoughtful. There were some people that greatly, quote, empathized with the Negro at that time, is what the word that was used, but they just weren't ready for all these changes. They needed 20 more years.
Right.
They were going to set race relations back 20 years was what was being said. I remember some of my professors even said that. Burst my bubble. I thought when I was in graduate school I was going to find people that were super intelligent and agreed with everything I agree with. Didn't work that way. There was a lot of discussion. I often found myself on the opposite side of the discussion and being very outspoken. And I remember knowing about the marches downtown. I know one time I was downtown, and I was around where the 5 and 10 cent stores were, Woolworths probably, and I was like they were coming out, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to be in the middle of this. And it's like, I really wanted to go join, and feeling very torn between, well, gee, I ought to go be part of this sit-in or march or whatever was happening. And it's like, I can't do that. I'll get thrown out of school. I can't do that. I'll get my head bashed in. I can't do this. I don't know these people. It was and feeling really torn. And finally, like, I just better leave, or I'm going to go join in, and I don't know what will happen to me. It was a real, I remember feeling very torn and really identifying with what they were doing, but not knowing how to interact. At that point, you
didn't have that support group.
I didn't have my support group. I did not have my few friends
in
in Birmingham.
Okay.
But as my year went on, I did find a few people that felt more like I did, and ended up being involved with a group of young people that were meeting at Thurgood Methodist Church.
This is in 63?
This is in 60.
During the demonstrations or after the demonstrations?
I think it would have been during the demonstration time. It was been 63 and 64.
Yeah. The demonstrations that is, known worldwide would have happened in April and May of 63. Now, there were continuing demonstrations, but these were the biggies. Were you meeting at Thurgood?
We did meet at Thurgood. Okay. And that may have been more into May and June. Okay. That we were meeting at Thurgood. A little bit later. And I remember from that we did do a few minor sit-ins. They weren't the massive things, but
downtown.
Downtown. I don't know that how much we were really linked in with any greater movement, but it was like we felt passionate. I remember we went to a Pizitz, I think. One of the department stores had a counter, and we decided to integrate and go. We paired up black, white, and we sort of went in and monopolized the stools, and they just simply closed the counter down. Didn't call the police to us or anything. So when they didn't call the police and didn't do anything, after a while it gets to be a waiting game, so we left. That kind of thing.
Were you served?
No, we were not. No, they just simply
closed the
counter, and we're not serving.
Right.
Just left, and they wouldn't be confrontive other than just they weren't going to serve. Period.
Right.
We're closed. It's past our opening hours. Even though we knew it was not.
Right.
I continued to be involved. Got more acquainted with a group of people here in Birmingham. Among those was a number of people around the Unitarian Church. Were involved, and I remember one incident that was really chilling to me was this would have been in the summer of 63. it was probably would have been after some of the meetings at Thurgood or that same group of people. And some of us had also been down to Gaston Motel. And I didn't have a car. This was when graduate students were really poor. And some friends were bringing me home, and this was, I think it was several, it was black and white, male and female. And there was actually an attorney with us, and I believe it was Paul Greenberg was with us at that time. He was one of those outside agitators, as they were always called, was with us. And they were, bringing whoever had to own the car was being the taxi, taking us all home. And I was brought home to 15th, to my home. This was when I lived at the Ronald McDonald House. And
that's 15th Street South.
17th Street South.
17th.
Yeah. And as we were almost in front of my apartment, the police stopped us and wanted to know what we were doing. And we just said, well, we've been to a meeting. And it's like, I'm going home. They're going home. First we took that tack, and then the police started, we all had to get out of the car. And then the police began to really harass us. And I thought what was interesting, it was very similar, or certainly reminded me of one of the scenes in Mississippi Burning, where people were stopped by the police.
Right. Now, was this both blacks and whites in the car? Or just
blacks and whites in the car.
Okay. And black men and white women?
It was black men and white women and white men and black women. It was, and this was before the days you wore seatbelts, so there were probably a lot of us in the car.
Were there any incidences as a result of that, other than you getting out of the car? What happened?
As we got out of the car, and the police then started harassing us. You need to...
Go ahead.
You're getting it? Okay.
Yeah.
I remember it was really interesting the way the policeman reacted to I think it was a black guy driving. And so the policeman told the black guys, like, you know better than to be hanging around with these white folks. They're going to get you into trouble. And there were several policemen in there, I think maybe about 3. Then one of the policemen told the white guy that was the attorney with us, Paul, and whoever he was, said, you even smell like a nigger. What are you doing here? And to me, he started harassing me of asking me if, I guess they were asking me something. They were implying I'd had sex with some black guy. And it was like, what do you want, a nigger baby? Is that why you're hanging around with these folks? And I was being, really wise guy at that time. And I said, well, if I had a baby, it wouldn't matter what color it was. And so then he started bristling, and he said, your daddy know you're here? And so I proceeded to tell him my father was a minister, and my father approved of he thought black and white people was the way Jesus wanted us to live in an integrated society or something like that. And I could just see this policeman just his face was getting red. Of course, all these were all white policemen. Sure. It's just getting redder in the face. I mean, he was even glowing in the dark practically. And I could just feel him getting ready. He put his hand on his side like he was going to pull his gun or his billy club. And I thought, I am going to get my head bashed in. We're all going to get hurt if I don't stop my wisecracks here. And so I said, officer, we've been to a meeting. It was about church. And I'm going in this house right here because this is where I live. And I took off. And he didn't try to stop me. And he told the guys and the other women in there, just get back in the car, we'll go on about your business. And followed them to the next stop where they would let some people off. And then did not harass them anymore. I guess in the meantime, they'd asked to see everybody's ID. So we all had fears that we were going to either lose our jobs or get thrown out of school. But nothing happened from that. But it really made me aware that of how strongly people felt, and how when the authority does not protect you in expressing these basic freedoms of interaction, that it's really scary, and it's really wrong. And so that was one of the things I remember that was really made an imprint. And it's just like, and the more I encountered those kinds of instances, the more I was determined to express myself, because you just, my view was as important as anybody else's was my attitude.
You mentioned that you had something about the A.G. Gaston Motel. Did you go there with that group?
We probably had
restaurant?
if I recollect, we had probably gone there after a meeting at Thurgood, because A.G. Gaston was about the only place in town that you could go and just socialize after a meeting if you were black and white. I think that to people hearing this after the 60s, to think about just people being black and white in a room is really, it's ludicrous. They think, what's the big deal about that? But that was really, it was very easy to make your statement then. Or just,
it was a revolutionary act.
It was a revolutionary act. That's a good way to put it. And I remember a number of times when going from, in groups where we were black and white together, all kinds of people would take it upon themselves to just suddenly begin following you. And I remember one time, this would have been later in '63, maybe even in '64, that we were...
You say all kinds of people. What do you mean by all kinds?
It's just like, you just be riding down the street and, a group of guys, either in good-looking, new cars or, ragtag...
Whites or blacks?
Whites.
Okay.
Or ragtag old cars, they decide that they were going to follow us to see what we were doing. And I remember several times being with groups and sort of outrunning people. One time we even got a group to follow us into the police station. Of course, the police were not much help, but we thought, well,
there.
if we'll drive into the police station here, maybe they'll go away, and they did.
In August of '63, the March on Washington.
I didn't go. I had a test the next week, and I felt I had to stay and study. I did not realize, I think I was that young, at the time I was still too young to realize the importance of the march. I had a number of friends that were going, and I really didn't.
Number of white friends and black friends?
White and black friends. And I remember some of my friends brought me some mementos from Washington from that event that I still treasure.
Right.
But I remember watching it a great deal on TV and saying, if there's ever others, it made me then marches since then when I really feel they're important, and if I can get my finances together, I go. But I did not go to that one simply because I was young, didn't understand how important it was, and I had a test on Monday.
Well, what did you actually feel about that march? Afterwards, you said you were probably not mature enough to really understand what was happening, the magnitude of it, but I'm sure that as you watched it on TV...
As I watched it on TV, it really came home. And I was 100%...
Did you think that this was a time, a pivotal point in the history of race relations in the country?
I didn't understand that then,
Okay.
but in retrospect, it certainly was. And but I remember just being very aware, being very supportive of it, having friends that were going. I do remember going on from '63, the church bombing, which took place then in September.
In September of '63.
Yeah, and I was in graduate school. I was still in graduate school. And I remember I was home visiting with my family in Sylacauga.
The morning of the bombing?
And where we first heard about it, we were in a family outing. We were in a car driving around. It was sort of one of those gray September days in Sylacauga. And it came in the news flash came over the car radio about it. And I was just aghast, It's like, oh, this is horrible. And my parents were just like, well, yeah, it's bad. But I was the one that was emotionally really reacting. Ended up coming back to Birmingham that night. My parents being very fearful about, well, maybe things are really bad, maybe you shouldn't go. And me of like, oh, I'll be fine, I'm going back. And I rode the bus back into Birmingham. And then a friend picked me up at the bus station downtown. I remember it was a really eerie feeling of, the streets were almost deserted.
And that was unusual for
That was
Birmingham.
very unusual at that point. And there were a lot of military. The National Guard had already been called out by late evening. And so the National Guard was there. One of the things I remember, of course it was on everybody's mind, one of the things that really touched me was how some people that I had argued with all the time about the importance of the civil rights movement, and they were taking opposite views. Some of those people, my fellow graduate students, came up to me and they apologized to me for the church bombing. And their feeling was, well, maybe you're right. Things have gone too far. This was not right. I'm sorry it happened, Virginia. It's like, why are you telling me? And, in retrospect, I realized that, it's sort of, in church you learn about the importance of sacrifice and changing people's behavior. And, of course, people who study group psychology talk about that a great deal. But it really clicked in there somewhere that, in many ways, that was the sacrifice that helped, one of the sacrifices, and a major sacrifice that helped turn this country around, sad though it is.
Yeah, that's interesting that you would say that your friends came to you and, in effect, apologized to you for the bombing. That meant that in their minds, then, that you were the symbol for that issue, or for black people.
I probably was for them, because I was one of the few people around. There were other people around the university like me that were very outspoken. But I guess I was the one that some of these people knew. Right. And they did. And I did go to, I know that the funeral for either one or several little black girls was held in what was 6th Avenue Baptist Church, when it was really on 6th Avenue South. Right. And I remember being at that and just standing outside with a mob of people, and I remember there were several university people there, mostly some faculty that were there.
What happens in the life of Virginia Volker after 1963 and 64? You have gone through graduate school. You were more mature. Do you remain in Birmingham? Do you leave Birmingham?
I stayed in Birmingham. I ended up getting married and getting involved in with the Unitarian Church, which was a church group that was one of the few churches in the white community that was taking a stand for civil rights.
What kind of activities were you involved in with the Unitarian Church in relationship to race?
One of the things from that group, I got connected with a group of women called Friendship in Action, which is another interesting story in and of itself. And I think that was really significant for me in that I had people like Deanie Drew and Sally Davis, Helen Lewis. Those are just some names that come to forefront. Some of the white women were Ani Krause was there, Peggy Fuller, several other women who are no longer with us. But Friendship in Action. A lot of that was a group of. It was pretty much, in retrospect, it was an establishment group, but it was more of a middle-class, liberal community group of people.
And what did you do?
And we said we wanted to be friends and learn to cross racial barriers on a personal level, but the term action in our name meant that we wanted to do more than just talk, that we wanted to make things change in society around us. If I remember correctly, one of the projects that we got involved with, along with Unitarian Church and a few others, to have one of the first like daycare Head Start programs that was integrated. We helped spearhead that. A lot of it, though, it was just simply about us talking, and then the things we were involved in the community taking a stand for improved relationships between people. Out of that grew another more formal organization called Panel for American Women. And Panel for American Women was started by Esther Brown up in Topeka, Kansas, who had been part of the effort to bring about the 54 Supreme Court decision. And it was very much, these two groups were very much a middle-class woman's response to what was happening. It's like, well, we will do things where we are, with women, with children, to try to make a good difference in the world. And Panel for American Women was, It was like, if we can go out, it was the belief that if we can get people to hear from their hearts, that's what will change people. And so we got together our speeches, so to speak, and we said that we would go as a group of, we usually had a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which was called WASP, and a black woman, usually a Jewish woman, and a Catholic woman. And we would go to various organizations and talk about the impact of the bad race relations on our family and on ourselves as a way of trying to persuade people to do otherwise and to be more pro-civil rights and more tolerant. And that organization did survive for about 5 years, and I hope had some good impact. I think it did on the people. I occasionally meet people who remember some of their programs. We also had in there a woman who was Japanese American who had been in a concentration camp in the Arizona desert when she was young, because she was Japanese and
on the West Coast.
In the West Coast, it got forced to move. So it was a very powerful group for a while, and that we had some powerful stories that we felt could touch people's heart and make a good difference. So that was very much a kind of woman response and involvement.
Well, Virginia, we've taken about an hour and a half.
I know.
And I certainly appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to just do this again sometime, but I want to thank you for coming.
Maybe we can talk about some other things.
Sure.
But I've tried to pick out some highlights and some things that people can identify with more. But I think one of the things I really learned from the Civil Rights Movement, well, first of all, I think I just feel very fortunate that I was born in a time and a place where this was happening. I feel very privileged to have been in Birmingham during that momentous year of '63. And I think it taught me the power of people, that people can make a difference. We're not powerless pawns totally. And I think one of the things I learned is only one person can only do one person's part. But if groups of people work together smart, we can make a big difference. And I also learned some things about the power of nonviolence there, and trying to reach people's hearts instead of just their heads or force their bodies. Learning that and knowing that and practicing it is more difficult, though.
In an exciting place at an exciting time.
It really was. I was fortunate.
Thank you, Virginia.
But it was also sad.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,